So what do we mean when we're thinking about programming? It's perhaps worth giving us an overview of this to kind of set everything up for us. Well, what is periodization is perhaps the logical starting point. Well, periodization, as we have here, it's simply a term that we use to describe the division of a training year. And it's dividing it up into manageable blocks, manageable phases. And each of these phases then has an objective, which has an aim of improving either performance, it might be improving physiological state or psychological state or biomotor capabilities. But they all have a key objective, and it's a way of structuring the year to kind of conform to this. So what we have is the plans that are used by pretty much the majority of athletes. If we're talking about linear plans, they normally have a number of competitive phases. So the number of competitive phases that we have in a year will determine the kind of plan that we use. So for example, if you've got an athlete who's just got one major competition period, it's not that they're not doing lots of smaller competitions, but one major competition. So let's say that they're competing at the Olympic Games, but that's it. They're not doing a qualifying event, they're not doing a winter season. So if that is the case, they are called monocyclic or a monocycle plan, mono for one. So it's one cycle. And that will have a preparatory phase, it will have a competition phase, and then it will have a transition phase. If, however, you've got an athlete that's, for example, doing, say, a winter season, so let's say they're doing indoor track and field, and then they go and do a major summer season, so they're doing the winter season, let's say it's the Europeans indoors, as an example, or the world's indoors, and then they go and compete at the Olympic Games. They've got two major competition phases. So that is called a bicycle plan. You can have what is called a tricycle. That is where you have three major competition phases. And I'll show you this schematically in a moment. What we tend to recommend, what the science informs us of, is that we should really be using monocycles with kind of novice or less experienced athletes. Bicycles, and particularly tricycles, are only really adopted when you've got highly experienced athletes, because it has a significant ramification on the volume of training that the athlete is going to be exposed to. So if we look at the literature, before we kind of delve into this, this is quite just a nice representation for us of showing us why we're interested in periodization. So this is data taken from a meta-analysis. And what it shows us here is we've got the notion of favouring and not favouring periodization. In other words, did the individuals who are exposed to periodization shown improvements? And they're showing this using effect sizes. They're using Hedges D to do this. And what you can see here is that we've got favours non-periodized training. Now look at the effect. So the effect is they've not been exposed to periodized training, and the largest effect that we're seeing is less than 1.0. So remember that an effect to be classed as large has to be greater than 8. So actually the majority of these studies are showing medium to small effect sizes. And actually the majority of studies in this meta-analysis are showing favouring periodization, but actually we really only start to get interested from this dashed line here, because this is an effect size of 0.5, which is a medium effect. So the majority of studies in here are showing medium to large effects. In other words, suggesting that periodization is beneficial as opposed to using a non-structured training approach. So what does it look like when we see our plan? So this is a representation of a training plan using a periodized model. And so what you have is you have the year divided up, and we have it divided up into kind of the consecutive weeks and then into the months. And then what we have is we have a representation of the competitions that they're doing. And this comes back to what I was mentioning in a previous slide, which is, remember I was talking about the idea of monocycle and bicycle and tricycle plan. This plan is actually referred to as being a monocycle plan. And you might go, well, hold on, there's multiple competitions in here. There are, but fundamentally, it's the international competition in this case it was a Paralympic Games, which is the only competition, it's the major competition that counts for the athlete. So the others, it's not that they're not important, but they're using these to progressively build to this. If, however, there had been, say, a winter season, they got a major international phase here, say a World Championships, then we would get into the bicycle-based plan. We then have other factors which are listed. If the athlete's being tested, are they going training overseas? But really, fundamentally, the important part is this latter period here, which is the brightly coloured stuff. Because what you then have is we have the kind of the components of the training period. So what you have is you have these blocks of training which are called, as we mentioned earlier, transition, preparation and competition. And the preparation is broken down into general prep and specific preparation, and the competition into general competition and specific competition. They're ways, as I said, of breaking up the year, remembering, as the previous slide intimated, there will be specific objectives for each of those phases. Then what we have is we have these kind of mesocycles, that let's call mesocycles, and these are really to represent the kind of the months or the weeks that are involved in this period of training. And you can see they're not all the same length. Some are devoted to more time. So it's just, again, a way of reflecting the time being devoted. Then this section here is just showing us what is actually being trained in these areas. And what you'll notice is there is that combination of training, which we mentioned in the session, which is on variables and components of training, where we said that one of the things to remember is that elite athletes really want kind of stability in a plan, but at the same time we recognise that we've got to train multiple components of fitness. And you can see the multiple components of fitness being trained in the different periods, but you'll notice that the kind of objectives are different. In the preparation phases, it's kind of base strength and so on. And as we move into the competition period, we move into intervals and short intervals, or we move into power-based training, so that the objectives change to get closer to the competition. And then finally, we've got this section here which reflects the balance between training volume and training intensity. In other words, it's the representation here of training load. And so this is just a graphical representation of the way in which the year has been divided, showing the fluctuations in the volume and the intensity over the year, and it's this intense period when we go into the competition, the major competition phase. Notice that this doesn't show us here the specific training sessions. This is just the starting point. This is the plan. Within each of these weeks, which sit within each of these blocks of training, there would be specific training sessions that meet the overall objectives of each of these blocks of training that we have listed here. And they would have to reflect the projected, because this is what we're projecting, this is the aim, the projected balance of the training intensity to the training volume. And the way to think about the division of the year is to think about it a little bit like this. That what we have is we have our overall macro, which is big. So that reflects, the macro cycle is the annual plan. So it's macro. We then go into what are called periods and phases. So the period, if we flick back to our previous slide, so here we've got kind of our periods. So we've got preparation and competition and transition. They become our periods. Our phases are then the subdivisions. We've broken preparation down into general prep and specific prep. We've broken competition down into general competition and specific competition. We then go into the mesocycles. So the mesocycles represent kind of the number of weeks worth of training that sit within the periods and the phases. Within a mesocycle, we have a microcycle. And the best way to think about a microcycle is normally, it doesn't have to be, is normally reflective of a week's worth of training. It doesn't have to be. The kind of the demarcation of it is at the end of a microcycle, there is normally a rest day or a period of rest. So some athletes might have a microcycle of 14 days worth of training before they have a rest day. That would be a microcycle. So it's just that the demarcation is when rest is applied. And then sitting within that, we have the sessions and the units. And so you have to think about this as kind of an inverted pyramid. The units fit into the sessions go into the microcycles, the number of microcycles dictates the mesocycle, a number of mesocycles determines the phases fit into the periods, and the periods sit inside the macrocycle. So one sits within the other. You can't think about any of these independently of the other one. So when we look at this in relation to that plan, so if you think back to that structure we saw a moment ago, so we just flick back very, very quickly. Here's our plan, and we've got our phases and our periods that we were talking about a moment ago. So if we now take it, here's our kind of preparation phase, and we've broken it down into general prep and specific prep. So we've kind of got our periods and our phases here. What we've then got is, sitting inside this, we've actually got 3 mesocycles. And the reason we know they're 3 mesocycles, one, I've indicated them with different shades of grey. But what you've got is, you can see that they've got, in essence, the training load increases, decreases. So just as we've got with our description of microcycles, that the microcycle generally ends on that point where you've got a reduction in the training load, so does a mesocycle. So we've got 3 mesocycles worth of training, and you can see here that they've been designed that there is a progressive overload. Can you see that the training load is progressively increasing as we move from this general prep to specific prep? But then sitting within inside these, can you see that what we've got is, we take this middle block, these are the microcycles worth of training. So the microcycle represents kind of that week's worth of training, and then each of these represents what is happening on each of those days. So the sessions and then the units would sit within inside those. So these graphical representations are then based absolutely on the sessions that are going to be used in relation to the intensity and the volume that's going to be applied to meet the specific objectives. So there'll be an objective for a microcycle, there'll be an objective then that fits into in terms of the mesocycle. The mesocycle objectives will then fit into the training phase objectives, which will fit into the training period objective, which will fit into the overall macrocycle objective for the training year.